Well, welcome to this session. My name is Keaton Halley, and I'm a speaker and writer for Creation Ministries International. Now this video is being pre-recorded, but if you stream it when we release it on YouTube, there's also a live chat feature, so you can interact with CMI staff, including me, and ask your questions related to this topic of Darwin or design. Now, our ministry, Creation Ministries, was founded 40 years ago, and for all that time, we've been proclaiming and defending this message that the Bible tells us the truth about origins. Genesis, in particular, gives us the true history of all things. That book is foundational to the rest of Scripture, and yet it is fiercely under attack in our culture in this day and age. So many people believe that evolution is a fact, and they ask Christians, how can you believe these stories any longer about God creating everything in 6 days and making Adam from the dust and Eve from his rib and so on? Well, we employ many PhD scientists and other experts to research these questions and to answer them for you. And we believe that when science is rightly understood, it strongly confirms the Scripture as God's Word. So for those watching today, I have a question for you. Do you believe that the Bible is trustworthy? If your answer is no, or if you're sort of on the fence, well, I hope you'll keep watching and I'll give you some things to think about. If your answer is yes, you're a Christian like me, well, then I want to ask you another question. Do you know how to defend your Christian convictions? Can you answer questions along these lines? How do we know that the Bible is true? If God created everything, why is there so much death and suffering in the world? What about all that evidence that supposedly proves evolution? Well, our ministry exists to answer these questions, and a great way to get equipped to be informed about these things is to sign up for our email newsletter. This is a totally free tool available to you, and in fact, you can actually sign up right now by simply texting your email address and your zip code to the number that I put on the screen. So I'll leave that number up for the next few slides so you can take advantage, sign up for our free email newsletter, and that will teach you the answers to those questions over the long haul. Well, let's return then to our focus, which is on living things. And we want to ask this question: Darwin or design? How did living things come about? Were they engineered by an ingenious creator, as the Bible teaches? Or did they come about through some unguided naturalistic evolutionary process, as Darwin believed and popularized? Well, it's amazing to me that no matter who you talk to, whatever worldview they come from, when we look at the world of living things, whether we're talking about the grandeur of one of nature's greatest beasts or the intricate details of the eye of a tiny insect, everyone's first impression is that someone must have made all of this. Not everybody comes to that conclusion ultimately, but that's our first impression. Just look at all the beauty and the sophistication present in living things. They look to be designed, and that implies a designer. Well, the Bible affirms this intuition that we all have. It says that's the correct conclusion to come to. Because the Bible never asks us to have a faith that's blind, that's without any evidence. No, it asks us to put our trust where the evidence is pointing. So for example, in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, speaking here of God, the Apostle Paul writes that his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived. In other words, this verse is saying that the evidence for God is overwhelming. Everybody really knows that he exists and that he is the creator. And how do we know that? Well, it says, ever since the creation of the world, this has been apparent in the things that have been made. And so we look at creation, that implies a creator. In fact, this verse says it's so obvious, all the evidence is all around us, that we don't have any excuse not to believe it. Nobody will be able to stand before God on the day of judgment and say, I didn't have any reason to believe that you existed. No, the evidence is all around us. So as I say, it's interesting, even atheists affirm this intuition, at least, a superficial appearance of design in nature. For example, Richard Dawkins, you may have heard of, perhaps the world's most famous atheist today, a champion of evolution, and he's written a book called The God Delusion. In another book called The Blind Watchmaker, look at the way he defines the science of biology. He actually says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Now, how remarkable is that? Because Richard Dawkins does not believe living things were designed for a purpose, but he admits that his first impression is that it appears that way. Now, of course, he goes on to write the rest of the book, arguing that the appearance of design is actually an illusion, and he tries to say that evolution can explain the impression we have of design in nature. Or take another example. Francis Crick is the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, and he says that biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why do these brilliant men of science have to keep reminding themselves that living things were evolved instead of designed by God? Well, it's because even to them, the impression of design is everywhere. Now, to be fair to these atheists, it's true that we can sometimes be mistaken when we see design someplace. There are lots of humorous examples of this. One that I like is back in 1976, when the Voyager spacecraft was flying out to Mars, and for the first time we got some close-up photos of the Martian landscape, planet Mars. And among the craters there, one of the details of the photos came back with this image. And so from straight up above, it looks like this hillside seems to have a face carved into it. And at the time, a lot of people got excited about this. They said, oh, this is a face on Mars. It's evidence that there are intelligent extraterrestrials, Martians, right, carving this face that's staring back at us. But of course, the appearance of design here is only somewhat superficial. And so it shouldn't be really surprising to anyone that years later, when we had more sophisticated satellites flying near Mars, they mapped out this same hillside, and it looks something more like this from another angle. So really, there's no appearance of a face there at all. And it's easy to explain how that hillside could be formed by natural processes, right? Things like gravity and wind and erosion. Well, the evolutionists might say, see, there you go. We can be fooled into seeing design when it's not really there. The same thing is happening with living things. They look designed at first blush, but no, evolution can explain that design. But I want to submit that we shouldn't be so fast to conclude that. Imagine, if you will, had we sent a satellite out to Mars and taken a photo of a hillside that came back with something like this. Well, then I think we would all agree it's conclusive that some intelligence had to be responsible for carving this structure. This level of detail is not going to come about by natural processes of wind and erosion. And so I want to submit that life is a lot more like this second example. When you get into the nitty-gritty details, evolution cannot account for the evidence. The evidence strongly favors that the impression of design is a correct one. So what we're going to do together today is look at 4 different arguments that evolutionists often give to support their theory, 4 reasons to supposedly accept evolution. But we're going to see that these same 4 reasons, actually, when you dive into those details, just like the Martian hillside, the evidence favors design. What are those 4 areas? Well, we're going to look at vestigial structures, first of all. Then we'll look at similarities in living things. We'll look at changes that we can see, we can observe with our own eyes today. And finally, we'll look at the cruelty in nature. That one's not so much a scientific argument, but more of a theological case for evolution and against God. So what do I mean by these categories? Well, let's explore them one at a time. First, vestigial structures. What are those? Well, a vestige is like a remnant or a trace that's left behind. So if you walk along the beach and you see some footprints in the sand, that's a vestige of a human being having once walked there. And of course, evolutionists say that there are many vestigial structures in our bodies. I'm sure that you've heard of some of these, things like the tonsils, the tailbone, the human appendix. These are things that evolutionists often claim are no longer functional or have a reduced function. And they're really just evidence of our evolutionary history, that we can trace our ancestry back to apes and back to monkeys before that. But there's not necessarily a problem in believing that some things are truly vestigial from a creationist perspective, because all that means is something's been broken since its original good design. And we certainly see, because the Bible teaches there was a fall, the entrance of sin and death into the world, that many parts of creation have become broken. For instance, in dark caves, it's very common to find creatures that over time, they lose the ability to see, that they may have mutations that damage the information to create their eyes, and so they're actually born blind with merely scar tissue where the eyes were in their ancestors. So you could say that, in a sense, that's a vestige of their ancestors having eyes. It's a vestigial structure. And creationists don't have a problem with this because it's a loss. It's not a gain. Can evolution work by losing and losing and losing and then suddenly have it all? No, that's not a good explanation. And so there's no problem in principle with vestigial structures for creationists. But we would say that evolutionists have been a bit overenthusiastic in finding all these structures that they don't immediately identify a function and then assuming that there is no function. For instance, back at the time of the Scopes trial, that famous court trial in Dayton, Tennessee, they had a number of scientists get onto the stand and give their arguments for evolution. And one of their key pieces of evidence at the time was what this man said: there are no less than 180 vestigial structures in the human body alone. Of course, since that time, we've discovered functions for essentially all of those supposed vestigial structures. And so in most cases, they really aren't vestiges at all. They're functional parts of our bodies that God designed. For example, in 2017, I visited New York City, where they have the American Museum of Natural History. And I was amazed to come across this sign amidst all their supposed evidence for evolution. The sign talks about the human coccyx, or our tailbone. Now, this is a little triangular piece of bone right down there at the base of our backbone. It's a part of our pelvis, essentially, the sacrum underneath there. Look at what the sign says about the tailbone. Look closely at the base of the human spine, and you'll find a tailbone, 3 to 5 vertebrae fused together. It serves no purpose, but reminds us that humans have descended from ancestral animals with tails. Well, really, is that all that our tailbone does? I'm sort of astonished that they would print something like this with all the scientific experts they have on staff at the museum. Because if you simply consult experts on anatomy and physiology, we know that there are many muscles and ligaments and tendons that attach to the tailbone. And so it is performing functions such as it helps to bear our weight when we're seated. It's like the third leg of a tripod. We've got 2 bones in the front of our pelvis. And then when we sit down, especially as we lean back, the tailbone helps to bear some of our weight. It's also, some of those muscles form the floor of our pelvis, helping to hold all of our internal organs in as we stand upright. And it's associated with a number of other functions as well. So the human tailbone is certainly not useless. And by the way, if you want to read more about this, you can search our website with the word tailbone or coccyx. And this article here in particular talks about the sign at the Museum of Natural History. Here's another example, the human appendix. That's this little worm-like process that comes off of our intestines. And you may know that people in our modern culture sometimes develop appendicitis. They have to get their appendix removed. It's true that you can live without some of these features. You can live without your tailbone and your appendix, but the rest of your body then has to do more work to keep up. Because it's not true that these things are functionless. The appendix, for example, we know is involved in our immune system. One of the things it does is stores good bacteria that aid in digestion in our gut. And especially when we get ill and expel the contents of our gut and lose some of those good bacteria, the gut can be repopulated by the good bacteria stored in the safe house of the appendix. But we're still learning more and more about the functions of the appendix. Even if we don't know all the functions that it has, that doesn't prove that it has none. One article that you'll find on our website talks about a very powerful reason to think that the appendix has a function. And that is because if you look at different types of organisms, many are missing the appendix, but others have it. And the distribution occurs in this spotty way so that the evolutionary researchers who investigated this question proposed that the appendix didn't just evolve one time and then get lost in its descendants, in that creature's descendants, but rather the appendix evolved in different branches of the evolutionary tree just by chance over and over again, a minimum of 18 times. So if the appendix is so useless, why does it keep arising in these creatures over and over again? Clearly, it is performing an important function. You know, I think the Bible actually has the best explanation of all the features of the human body, as we read about in Psalm 139, which talks about how we're knit together in our mother's womb. And verse 14 says, "I praise you, Lord, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well." So we've begun by looking at vestigial structures and seeing that in some cases there are true vestiges, but in most cases these are actually functional parts of good creation after all. Let's look then at our next subject, that is the similarities in living things. This is a key way that I was taught evolution in high school. What you often find in high school biology textbooks, for example, is this diagram where you see these four very different types of creatures all have this similar pattern in their limbs. They have a 5-digit limb pattern. What I mean is they've got one bone in their upper arm and then an elbow joint, two bones in their lower arm and then a wrist joint, and 5 digits in the hand. Even in creatures like the bird and horses and other vertebrates have this same pattern, even though all these organisms use their arms and legs for very different purposes, right? Frogs use their legs for hopping, birds use their wings for flying, seals use their flippers for swimming. So the evolutionists say the reason that we find this similarity in creatures is because the common ancestor of all these creatures, the great-great-great-grandparent, already had this pattern and it passed it on with slight variations to its offspring. Now, I've never thought that that's a very good argument for evolution, because if evolution is so good at changing things, then why did it leave the pattern intact with all these diverse structures? But another problem is that we have a standoff here because there's another possible explanation for the similarity. That is, it could be the similarity exists because a common designer is the one who designed all these things. Now, why would God give very different types of creatures a similar pattern? Well, for one thing, there might be some good engineering constraints on why you design an arm or a leg in this way. When humans even design robots today, we use some of these same patterns very often, as well as musicians and artists often repeat themes in their work. So God could have any number of good reasons for why he would build these different creatures with similar structures. But are we simply at a stalemate here? Is the evolutionary explanation just as good as the creationist one? Well, not at all. Again, just like that Martian landscape, look at the details, and the evolutionary story begins to fall apart. So for instance, if the human hand and the frog foot, if the reason for the similarity is because they inherited that pattern from a common ancestor, then we would expect to find, as human beings develop as embryos in their mother's womb, that as the limbs begin to grow, it would follow the same pattern that causes the frog digits to grow. But the way they develop is actually radically different. Human hands begin as a plate, and the material in between the fingers actually dissolves away, whereas the frog foot begins like a fist, and from initial buds, the digits grow outward into toes. And there are many examples like this where sometimes it's the genes that code for the similarities are different genes. We also find some similarities that defy the evolutionary predictions. For instance, you see things like the eyes that humans have and all vertebrates have are very similar to the eyes of octopuses. We have a camera lens system. Now, no evolutionist would claim that the reason for that similarity is because the common ancestor of humans and octopus already had this camera type of eye. Rather, they would say, once again, on separate branches of the evolutionary tree, just by chance, camera type eyes evolved independently. Now, many of you folks thought that eyes already could not form at all by natural processes. Do you realize the evolutionists say it happened over and over again? In fact, John Rennie, the editor of Scientific American, says that it now appears that in various families of organisms, eyes have evolved independently. Some evolutionists have said over 60 different times. Blind forces of nature can't make a seeing eye. No, once again, I believe the Bible has the better explanation. As we read in Proverbs 20:12, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Let me give you one other amazing example of how similarities defy the evolutionary predictions. Echolocation we find in organisms as diverse as bats and dolphins. There are some birds that actually have some ability to echolocate as well. But again, no evolutionist would claim that the common ancestor of bats and dolphins already had this highly specialized ability to locate their prey by emitting sound waves and listening back to the pattern that returns. Frankly, to use similarities as an argument for evolution doesn't fly even logically, because designed objects exhibit many of these same patterns of similarity. Dump out all the utensils in your kitchen drawer, for example, and you can arrange them into a nested hierarchy, right? Patterns of similarity, finding things that are more closely similar than others, and you sort of arrange them into an evolutionary tree. It doesn't prove that those objects were not designed. Far from it. The same thing we can do with Mexican food, for example. Here's the the evolution of the taco, if you will. No, just because designed objects exhibit similarities does not prove one evolved from the other. So we've looked at vestigial organs in living things. We've looked at similarities in living things. Let's now focus on the changes that we can see happening before our eyes. Evolutionists often point to things like bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics, animals adapting to new environments, and so forth. And they say, look, we see these changes. Isn't that clear then that creation is incorrect? Well, no, oftentimes this is presented as though creationists deny any and all changes in living things. But that's not the case. Long before Charles Darwin, even, creationists understood that living things can undergo significant changes. We knew about modern breeds of dogs, for example. It's breeders that have produced all these different varieties in the recent past. All these modern breeds of dogs don't go all the way back to the time of Adam and Eve, right? We didn't have Chihuahuas in the Garden of Eden, no poodles or dachshunds or Great Danes or German Shepherds and so on. All domestic varieties of dog have actually descended from a more robust ancestor, something more like a wolf. And so wolves and dogs are related. And really, the Bible would lead us to expect that these types of changes can occur. The changes have limits, but there can be great variation within each biblical kind. The reason we would expect that is because the Bible teaches that all the animals in the world, specifically the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals, basically we would classify them today as land vertebrates. All those land vertebrates, representatives of each kind, went onto the ark at the beginning of the flood. And then after the flood waters subsided, those animals spread around the world and repopulated the world and descended into the modern varieties that we see today. And so we got all the dogs in the world from just a pair of canines aboard the ark. So the Bible would lead us to expect that a lot of variation is possible, but that the changes have limits. Because it says in Genesis chapter 1 that when God created the world, he made distinct kinds of plants and animals. Actually, over 10 times in the creation account, that phrase is used, that God made them after their kinds. And in some cases, it says that they would reproduce, they'd bring forth after their kinds. And this, of course, fits with our everyday experience. We know that when human mothers go to the hospital to have a new baby and they bring home the baby, it's not going to turn out to be a chimpanzee this time, right? We know it's going to be a human. Fish produce fish, dogs produce dogs, and this is what the Bible teaches. We also see that during the different days of creation week, God made distinct things on the space of different days. For example, on day 3 is when God made plants. Those were created supernaturally and separately from the flying creatures and swimming creatures on the 5th day. And those were separate from different types of land creatures made on day 6, also separate from man that God made from dust and from a rib. But the Bible does not use that modern scientific term species. It says that God created things according to their kinds. So how do these terms relate? Is a kind the same thing as a species? No, a kind is a much broader category within which you can have many species. Now, in a previous webinar, we already covered this ground in detail, but I'll just give you a bit of review here. A good example to illustrate this is large cats like lions and tigers and leopards. They're classified as different species, but they're not different kinds of animals. They actually belong to one kind. One of the ways that we know that is you can try to breed them together and see if they can produce offspring. If they're able to hybridize, then they would belong to the same biblical kind. So you cross a male lion with a female tiger, and that makes a liger. And we've seen that the same thing is true with many other mammals, for example. You cross a camel and a llama, that makes a comma. A cow and a buffalo makes a beefalo. A zebra and a donkey makes a zonkey. Zebra and a horse cross produces a zorse. A goat and a sheep makes a jeep, or maybe that's what you drive, right? I'm not sure how you pronounce that one. Pig and a boar cross, I don't even know what you'd call that one, except somebody once said dinner. When you cross a grizzly bear and a polar bear, that makes a pizzly bear, or a growler in some cases. And at SeaWorld, my favorite example is when they had a killer whale and a bottlenose dolphin in the same tank. One became pregnant, and the curators were surprised when along came a baby wholphin calf not so long afterward. So what this goes to show is that Noah didn't have to bring aboard the ark 2 of each lion, 2 leopards, 2 tigers, and so on. Rather, he just brought 2 cats. He brought 2 canines. He brought 2 of the cow and buffalo kind, and so on. Another way to illustrate this is with evolutionary tree diagrams. Evolutionists believe in a single tree of life where at the trunk here, you've got a single-celled organism that gives rise to all the diversity of living things that have ever existed over millions of years. They often accuse creationists of believing in this lawn idea where we say God made each species distinct from one another, no horizontal branching occurred, maybe somewhat extinct over time, but in the present, all the species look the same as they did back at the time of Eden. But that's not what creationists actually believe. We believe in something more like an orchard of life, where there are supernaturally created separate kinds of living things, but over time, within each kind, you can have diversity as the genetic information gets shuffled out and sorted in the offspring. Now, evolutionists often confuse the issue by using the word evolution in multiple ways, switching the meaning mid-argument. For instance, you might have some evolutionary professor say to his students, "How can you deny evolution? I can see evolution happening in the laboratory." But what's he observing in his lab? It's variations on a theme, minor changes within butterflies, for example. And yet what he's trying to convince his classroom of is that microbes can turn into mankind over millions of years. It's not enough to simply point to any and all changes. We need to distinguish between the types of changes that we're observing. And evolutionists not only need downhill changes, they need new genetic information to be crafted by natural processes. But what do I mean by genetic information? Well, that molecule of heredity, DNA, that's inside all the cells, or most of the cells in our body, it's shaped like a spiral staircase. And the individual steps of the staircase represent chemical letters. Now, the order of the letters is not given by the laws of physics and chemistry. They can occur in any which order, just like you print letters on a piece of paper. The laws of physics and chemistry don't tell you what the arrangement of the letters has to be. You can arrange them into meaningful sentences. And it turns out there are instructions in DNA. It encodes a message, a recipe, if you like, for how to build a human body and other things. And there's not just a little bit of information in DNA, there are books and books worth. For example, Richard Dawkins says that there is enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over. That's a lot of information present in living things today. But then the question for evolutionists is, how did this genetic information come about? Can not natural processes produce this without a designer? To illustrate why this is an important question for evolutionists to answer, consider again that tree of life. In the evolutionary story, billions of years ago, living things somehow came into existence, single-celled creatures, if you will, but at that time there were no trees yet in the whole world. Trees had not yet evolved, and so how did the information, the instructions to make tree bark get written? Later on, there was a world filled with trees and other living things, but birds had not yet arisen. And so how did the instructions to make feathers arise? And that's the question that we pose to evolutionists as a challenge. Are the changes that you typically point to as proof of evolution, are these the types of changes that produce new and complex information? The typical examples of evolution given are not examples of increases in information. They almost invariably involve losses. You might think of it like this. It's very easy to fall down the stairs. Evolutionists are claiming that living things fell up the stairs, if you will, all the way to the top. And so we want them to supply some examples of falling up just one stair at a time so we can see these information gains. Now, what sort of mechanisms of evolution did they propose to increase the information content in the biosphere? Well, of course, natural selection is a key. They often say they equate natural selection with evolution itself. But of course, creationists, once again, can observe, and we believe in natural selection. It's a process that operates in nature, but it's not an information creating process. That's why it's not a good argument for evolution. So we can illustrate natural selection with dogs. We've already seen that our modern dog breeds were produced largely by artificial selection, that is, human breeders getting involved in the work. But dogs are also related to other canines, things like wolves and coyotes, dingoes, and jackals, and so on. If all these dogs came from just a pair of canines aboard Noah's Ark, how did all that diversity come about? Well, if this pair of dogs here represents two dogs that came off of Noah's Ark. Let's discuss how natural selection would work in the population. So let's assume, and I'll give you sort of the basic principles here, which apply to more complex situations, but I'll give you a simplistic example of how this works. So let's say you have two dogs, a male and a female, and each have two genes that code for the length of their fur. They have one gene, which is L, which represents long fur, and an S gene to make short fur. Now, some genes work this way, where if you have both together, they produce a blended effect. And so what's expressed in these dogs is a medium length fur, not long or short. Now, if those dogs have puppies after the flood is over, they can produce a variety of offspring in the next generation because the offspring will inherit a mixture of genes, one gene from dad and one from mom. And it's a random mixture. So some of the puppies will be born with two S genes. They'll have short fur. Some will get an L from mom and an S from dad, or vice versa. They'll have medium length fur. And others will inherit two Ls. They'll be born with long fur. So far, what's happened is we've sorted out the information in the population that God built into it to begin with. But here's where natural selection comes in. Let's say that shortly after the flood, the dogs encounter an ice age. Now, which dogs are going to survive in an ice age? Only the dogs with long fur. So let's say it's a very harsh winter that first year. It kills off all the dogs with short fur and medium length fur. Only the long fur dogs survive. Now, what's going to happen when they produce offspring? When long fur dogs get together, they've only got those L genes. That means all their offspring are also going to inherit those L genes. The genes for short fur have been removed. They've been selected away. So that is an example of natural selection. But isn't it an example of evolution? Not at all, because even though what's happened on the surface is that we've gone from a population of medium fur dogs to long fur dogs in just 2 generations, but what's happened on the level of genetic information? We started with a lot of variety, L and S genes, and we ended up with less variety. Genes have been removed, they've been taken away. We've not added information, we've decreased the information. So when you move away from something like the ancestral dog, wolves are probably closer genetically to the canines aboard the Ark, and you move toward our modern varieties of dogs, those purebred dogs have had a lot of the variability removed from their gene pool. And so you go toward less information. And you can even get to the point where you have very little information left at all. In a sense, you might say that the Chihuahua is swimming in the shallow end of the gene pool. Often these types of dogs that we breed together just with their own type, we call those purebred dogs. But if you think about it, inbred is essentially a synonym for purebred. These dogs are very inbred, and they have all sorts of problems in their genes because they're not mixed with their ancestral population. Well, of course, many informed evolutionists would acknowledge that yes, natural selection by itself cannot create that new information. But what produces the raw material for natural selection to work on, they say, the source of those variations would be mutations. Now, mutations, of course, are acknowledged by creationists as well. We see them happening in nature. They're essentially genetic mistakes, defects that occur. Like if you have a dog that's got normal, healthy legs, when his information is copied to his offspring, maybe the information to make his legs gets damaged and the puppies are born with short, stubby little legs. Oftentimes, mutations in DNA are just a single letter change. Kind of like if you were writing out a phrase, to dust you shall return, you're copying this on your own computer, and you accidentally hit the wrong key, you type an N instead of an O. Now, is this sentence different from the one you were intending to type? Yes, it is. It's a different sentence, but is it an example of new information being created by random processes? Well, not really, because the word you knew doesn't have any meaning in English. It's gobbledygook is what you've produced. And oftentimes the changes to DNA produce gobbledygook. They destroy the complex structures and machinery that exist in living things. We don't want to know how you can ruin information. We want to know how that information was created. Now, as you can sort of intuitively recognize, this doesn't mean that it's absolutely impossible for natural processes to create information just by chance, at least in small amounts. For example, with English sentences, you might accidentally come up with a meaningful sentence by hitting the wrong key. In a parking lot one time, I was amused to see a sign that read like this: Violators will be towed and fined $50. Well, it seems to me that there was a typo in this sign. Somebody left out an important E. And so the sign does actually contain a different meaning than the one that was intended. It's a good example of how just by chance new information can be produced. However, when we look at living things, overwhelmingly the mutations that we observe are not adding new information, they are destroying information. So let me give you some examples of that. This creature here is a chicken that has a mutation that damaged his ability to make feathers. So he was born without any feathers. This is sometimes called the TNR mutation, which stands for totally naked rooster. And so obviously this is a loss of information. The mutations damaged his genetic instructions. But in other cases, it might not be as obvious. So here is another bird, for instance. This poor little creature has a mutation that causes his feathers to keep growing more and more and not stop growing. He's supposed to look something like this, a budgerigar. So is this an example of an increase in information? His feathers grow more than they should? Well, no, even in this case, what the mutation has done is damaged a switch in his DNA that was supposed to tell his feathers to stop growing at a certain point. The information has been corrupted, and so his feathers can't switch off. And so this clearly doesn't help the organism, and it's another defect, a loss of information. What about when you have information duplicated? Sometimes whole segments of DNA get accidentally copied in extra time. For instance, here is a mutant turtle. I don't know if he's ninja, but he's got 2 heads. Is that a good example of an increase in information? Well, no. If you have 2 copies of a newspaper and you read it through 2 times, are you twice as informed the second time? Only if you didn't read very carefully the first time, right? Duplication typically is not going to increase the information. Now, there might be some exceptional cases where with genetics, you can have a new product be formed and speed up a reaction as a result of having more copies of it. So maybe in some trivial way, that's a gain of a small amount of information. But although it's not impossible to gain information, what evolutionists need to supply, if their theory is true, is heaps and heaps of examples. We should see information gains all the time by natural processes, and yet the typical examples they cite are not examples of information gains. Once again, we don't want to know how to get a second head if we've already got instructions to make a head in the first place. We want to know, where did the instructions to make a head come from to begin with? Now, it's important to make a distinction here. Informed creationists should not say that there's no such thing as a beneficial mutation. There are, in fact, beneficial mutations in the sense that even a loss of information can be to an organism's advantage. In a certain environment, even defects can be helpful. They can help an organism to pass on its DNA. So a good real-life example of this is oftentimes on small windy islands, you find that they're populated by certain types of beetles that do not have wings. But if you look over on the mainland, you have a very similar type of beetle that does have wings. And so what's the explanation for how you get these very similar beetles, but one wingless? Well, most likely, the ancestors of all the beetles had wings. They flew onto this windy island. But on a windy island, it's not actually an advantage to have wings. It might actually harm you because you could get blown into the sea and drown. And so if by chance some of those beetles are born with a mutation that damages their ability to create wings, then they may become more prominent on the island, whereas the winged ones remain more prominent on the mainland because they can escape from predators. So this is a good example of how you can have adaptations to a new environment, changes within living things, a defect be an advantage to an organism, but it's still through a loss of information. And so once again, we challenge evolutionists to show us, where are all the examples that we ought to find in nature, heaps and heaps of new instructions being written by the changes that we observe. This is not what we see today. So once again, let's review. We've looked today at vestigial structures, similarities in living things. We've looked at the changes that we can observe over time. And so let's come to our fourth and final point, that is the cruelty in nature. Now, this is, again, not a scientific argument for evolution, but it's a common way that evolutionists argue. For instance, if you've ever watched those nature documentaries you see on the Discovery Channel, the BBC, Nova, and so forth, do you ever get frustrated if you're a Christian by hearing all the evolutionary content of those programs? Well, I certainly do. One of the narrators that's very common on these documentaries is a British naturalist named Sir David Attenborough. And Attenborough is a thoroughgoing evolutionist. And so many Christians have written to Attenborough and asked him, why do you so often give the credit to evolution? Can't you recognize the handiwork of the Creator? And Attenborough has a ready response that he's given on a number of occasions. He says this: when creationists talk about God creating, they always instance hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers, and beautiful things. But I tend to think instead of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on the bank of a river in West Africa, a worm that's going to make him blind. And I ask those creationists, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you also say is an all-merciful God, who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying that God is the designer of this parasitic worm? Because that doesn't seem to me to coincide with the God who's full of mercy. Now, I think that is a sobering challenge from someone of the stature of David Attenborough. And how would you answer that question yourself? Is that evidence against the God of Scripture that we find so much death and suffering, not even among human beings, but in the realm of nature? Well, not at all. If we merely teach that God is some vague, intelligent designer who's created the world, then we might be left without an answer to Attenborough's challenge. But at Creation Ministries, if we want to affirm more than that. We also say that God has revealed himself in his word. And that means we believe not only the creation account, but also the account of the fall with Adam and Eve. The Bible tells us that Adam and Eve rebelled against their creator, and then God cursed the ground for Adam's sake and said, now it's going to bring forth thorns and thistles. The creation today is groaning and travailing in the pains of childbirth, as it says in Romans chapter 8. There's something wrong with the world, but the reason is because of our sin. And so a lot of times other Christians take issue with us at Creation Ministries International. They'll say, well, I support what you're doing in the fight against evolution, but the age of the earth, that's not really so important. Let's leave that issue to the side. But here's an example where the age of the earth actually comes into play. It matters more than many people realize. Because if you believe that God created over millions of years, then you really don't have an answer to Attenborough's challenge, because what we find in the fossil record, that supposed evidence of millions of years, is lots of death and disease. Is that what Genesis teaches? No, we find that Genesis says that God made all things very good in the very beginning. He pronounced all of creation good. It was a paradise free from death and suffering. But if God had used millions of years to make the world, dinosaurs lived millions of years before Adam and Eve, then Adam and Eve were actually standing on top of a fossil graveyard. The fossil record that we find in the crust of the earth with all these buried bones representing supposedly eons and eons of death. And we find diseases in the fossil record. We even find parasites deep down in these fossil layers, like the one that Attenborough referred to. And so if you say, that's the way God created the world, then the world was filled with death and disease, and it's not a consequence of our sin. But the Bible teaches that it was human sin that caused the world to fall. God judged the world on account of our sin, and that's why the world is broken. Romans 8 talks about how the world is groaning and travailing in pain together until now. And so that actually points us to our need for a Savior. The Bible not only teaches that God is the creator, but it also teaches that he is the Redeemer. He sent his Son, Jesus Christ, on a rescue mission from heaven to die on a cross for our sins so that we could be reconciled to our Creator. And as it says in Colossians chapter 1, for in him, that is in Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So Jesus came to not just rescue humanity out of creation, but to fix the broken world. One day God's going to make a new heavens and a new earth to come. Well, let's review then. We've looked today at 4 reasons evolutionists give that they think favor their evolutionary ideas. But we've seen that actually when you look at the details, the evidence more strongly favors the truth of biblical creation. We looked at vestigial structures and saw that in some cases there are true vestiges, but they're not proof of evolution. in most cases, they're functional after all. We also looked at the similarities in living things and saw that those don't point to a common ancestor, they point to a common designer of all life. We looked at the changes occurring now in living things and saw that those don't add information into the biosphere, rather they're destroying information. They're simply variations within biblical kinds. Finally, we looked at the cruelty in nature and saw that that is not inconsistent with the God of love. It's evidence that the world is fallen because of man's sin. And so the bottom line today is that living things still shout design. The more you look at all the details, the more obvious it becomes that God is the creator. So I encourage you to get to know some of those details. Maybe you can watch this program again to review. You can watch many other programs that we produce through our ministry. If you're on YouTube right now, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and that way you won't miss any content from us in the future. We have many different videos that get released, like our Creation Talk programs, where we have a couple of experts from our office chat together about issues relating to Genesis and science. You can get the audio via your favorite podcast app as well. Tools like Creation Magazine. This is one of my personal favorites. 4 issues each year. It's full color and no paid advertising. And in every issue, we have an article about a fascinating creature that God has designed. We had one not so long ago about the mimic octopus. You may know that octopuses in general can camouflage their skin to hide from predators, but the mimic octopus is exceptional. It actually changes the shape and texture and color of its skin to impersonate at least 15 different animals to hide from predators. Here on the screen, you see it's imitating a flatfish, a flounder that swims along the ocean floor. Other times it imitates poisonous creatures that predators might not want to mess with. And so Creation Magazine is a great way to inform and equip your faith to defend against evolution. Also, there are some great books that I'd recommend. Richard Dawkins has written a case for evolution called The Greatest Show on Earth. And our staff scientist, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, responded point by point in this book he called The Greatest Hoax on Earth, refuting Dawkins on evolution. It's a powerful critique in its own right. This is a good overview of the issues at a high school level. Covers things like ape men and the origin of life and a broad range of subjects. It's great to use in a textbook if you're a homeschooler, and there's a free online student workbook included as well. Oftentimes when we present the evidence for design in nature, the question that comes back is, well, if God created all things, then who created the creator? Where did God come from? Have you ever been asked that question? Well, we can answer that as well. So I encourage you to pick up this DVD to find out more about how to answer that challenge. And there's lots more research that you can do and answers that you can find on creation.com. We have just thousands and thousands of articles for free, video content as well. Shop in our store for ebooks and video downloads. And I hope you'll take advantage of creation.com. Bookmark it on your smartphones and your computers. Well, I want to leave you with one final verse from Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4. There it says that every house is built by someone, which is obvious, right? You look at a house, it must have had a builder. But the builder of all things is God. And so design is not simply an illusion in living things. No, the more that you examine the details, the more it becomes clear that creatures are the masterful handiwork of their creator. So I thank you for listening in today. We're going to hang out on the live chat for just a bit longer if you want to be active and ask some more questions related to the topics that we've covered in this session. And for more, you can find it on creation.com. We'll see you next time.